morning. We're going to continue on our theme of nature today by talking more about how we are all connected to each other. Now, this is a theme we've touched on before. I read you a couple of stories. Remember, trout are made of trees. We talked about the trout are so dependent on the trees, both for food, but also for the shade that they provide that keeps the water temperature cool enough for them to live in. And we read the book, The Tree in the Ancient Forest, which talked about those animals nesting in the trees at the bottom of the tree and the roots. And um, so they needed the tree and then other animals that needed those animals. And it all came back around to the tree again. Do you remember those? But we aren't going to be reading a story today. Instead, I'm going to be telling you a couple of really cool examples of um, species that are dependent upon other species for their survival. And we're going to talk about how trees talk to each other. They actually do communicate with each other, not that differently than we do, except, well, it's different because they don't do it with voice, right? But they very much communicate with each other, and it's pretty cool. But first, I'm going to tell you about the pearl mussel. Now, the pearl mussel is a freshwater pearl that is known for its large, fine pearls. And the pearls can be are pretty cool. They can be different colors. They might be tinted pink, or sometimes they're more silver. And it takes years for them to form. So they form because they're the result of a little speck of sand, or more often, people think of it as not sand, but more often it's actually a parasite that gets inside the pearls, inside the mussel's shell, or some other irritation. And the mussel coats this irritant in calcium and then adds another layer, and more layers of calcium are deposited around this little parasite or piece of sand. So basically, I mean, a parasite is sort of like dead worms. So basically, pearls are the tombs of dead worms. You think about it like that, it's sort of gross, actually, but the pearls are so pretty. Their range used to stretch from the Arctic to Portugal and horizontally from Russia to North America, but they aren't nearly so widespread now. But they can still be found, this particular mussel, this pearl mussel, can still be found in Scotland. And there's this really cool symbiosis that happens. And symbiosis is when one thing is dependent upon another, and they both benefit from this relationship. It's mutually beneficial. And the pearl mussel has the symbiosis with fish. So in order to reproduce, the pearl mussel is entirely dependent upon a whole nother species, and a very specific species. So it's either the Atlantic salmon or brown trout. So how it works is that female mussel releases her larvae, which are like baby mussels before they're actually formed into mussels. She releases the larvae into the water, and she'll spew out 1 to 4 million of them. It's crazy, but most of them are swept away and don't survive. So that's why she spews out so many, so that you will survive. And these few lucky ones that do survive, they're really tiny. They're less than zero point 0.1 millimeters. And these few lucky ones are hailed by either an Atlantic salmon fish or a brown trout. And not only that, but only by the young fish, only by the juvenile fish. And so those that aren't yet adults. So the young fish of either brown trout or Atlantic salmon. And that's it. That's the only fish that these larvae can survive on. So the young salmon or the trout grow a protective layer around the mussel larvae, which is sort of cool because that's sort of like what the mussels do later, right? When they're creating that protective layer around the parasite or bit of sand that gets in their shell. And the larvae hitch a ride on the fish until the following spring, at which point they drop off the fish once they are fully formed as it's still young as a mussel. And once they have done that, it takes them 15 to 20 years to become an adult. Isn't that crazy? So it's sort of like us. And they can live as long as us, or they can live even longer, 100 or 200 years. So they have quite the lifespan. The point is that if there's no Atlantic salmon or no brown trout on which these larvae can hitch a ride on and use as their house until spring, the mussel larvae will just get swept away and die. So the pearl mussel, in general, the population of the pearl mussels cannot survive without these two fish species and these very specific species. So it's pretty amazing. Another way that one species is dependent upon another species is trees, and it has to do with how trees communicate. So you've seen mushrooms before, and mushrooms are one part of the larger creature of a fungus. So the mushrooms are what you see and what you recognize, but most of the body of a fungus is actually made up of this really large mass of thin threads under the soil. That's why you don't see them, that are known as mycelium. Now, these threads act as sort of almost like an underground internet. It's actually, some people actually call it the wood wide web, like the world wide web. I think that's a little cheesy, but that's what it's sometimes called. And it's actually a very appropriate name because think of the internet as all these wires connecting different people all over the world. And these mycelium do the same thing. They're these little threads that connect all the trees through their roots. And they link the roots of different trees and different plants together, just like the internet links all of us together as people, or most of us, those of us who have internet. So this is beneficial both for the trees and for the fungus. So it's another situation of symbiosis. The trees provide the fungus with food, so carbohydrates and sugars that the trees are creating for themselves, but they also share that with these fungus. So they're providing food for the fungus. And the fungus have a very important role for the trees in that they help suck up water from the soil and various nutrients from the soil, and they help deliver these to the roots of the trees. But they do much more than that. This is where it gets really cool. I mean, that in itself is pretty cool, but this is even better. So, a little over 70 years ago, scientist Suzanne Simard from Canada discovered that birch trees and fir trees, two different species, exchange nutrients with each other. How crazy. And they do that through the mycelium. So these little fungus threads, roots that are growing all through the soils, and they're attached to the roots of the trees, and they are sharing nutrients in the trees, right? Well, the birch trees and the fir trees will use these mycelium that are attached to their roots to share these nutrients with each other. And it's also been discovered that when some trees might be under threat by either a disease or maybe it's a drought or insects that are eating them, they can send out warnings to the other trees through the mycelium about this threat. And then the other trees are prepared, right? They can prepare to defend themselves against the threat, insects, for instance, or some disease, just like with COVID, right? You know, there's COVID out there, so you get a vaccination. Well, trees have a way of protecting themselves from certain diseases or insects. And so when one tree can use its mycelium to communicate with another tree and say, hey, this bug is coming, this disease is coming, you better do something about it. So the other trees are prepared and they can ward off the threat. Sometimes a pair of trees are so closely dependent upon one another that when one dies, the other dies soon after it, right? So you think of trees as individual beings because that's what you see in the air, right? So you see one tree over here, another tree over there, and some of the same species, some are different species, and they all seem like individuals. But scientists are discovering that they are in fact communal. So they're dependent upon each other, just like we humans are. So it is sort of like us, right? We see ourselves, we are individual people, but, and when we look around, we see these individual bodies, right? But there's these invisible threads, just like those invisible threads in the mycelium connect the trees. There's invisible threads out there connecting all of us as people. And I'm not talking about the wires of the internet. I'm talking about those ways that we are dependent upon one another. So some more obvious examples is that we are dependent upon our parents when we are young to take care of us when we aren't able to take care of ourselves. Or we're dependent upon other species too, like we've talked about with trees. As people, we wouldn't be able to breathe if the trees did not provide us with oxygen that they are converting from carbon dioxide in the air. So there's these little threads, these little ways that we are all connected to each other. And it's invisible, but just like the trees are in fact communal, we are communal as people too, and dependent upon each other and dependent upon other species. And there's other species that are dependent upon us as well. So instead of reading the story today, I want you to think about who are you dependent upon? What other people are you dependent upon? And yeah, the parents are sort of one obvious answer. So I want you to think more broadly to them. And maybe it's not someone that's directly dependent upon you, but someone out there that whose life would not be quite the same without you around, or maybe they couldn't even survive without you. And then think about other species. Are there animals or plants that are dependent upon you to live? You have some house plants or a garden, and those plants would be dependent upon you. If you have any pets, those animals are dependent upon you. And then look around, think about it the other way. Um, who are, sorry, that's who's dependent, who you are dependent upon. And switch around and think, um, who is dependent on you, right? So you have both ways. So like your dog is dependent upon you. If you take care of plants, they're dependent on you. And then who are you dependent upon as well? And just think about directly or indirectly all these different connections that you have with so many people and so many other species around the world. So that is it for today's lesson. Take care of yourselves, take care of others, be kind, and I'll see you next time.